I'm going to read you an excerpt from Chapter 1 of Herman Melville's novel Redburn. He wrote Redburn in 1849, 2 years before Moby Dick. There's a first-person narrator reminiscing about his childhood fascination with the sea and the odd things his father, who is a merchant, brings home, make him dream of travel. In course of time, my thoughts became more and more prone to dwell upon foreign things, and in 1,000 ways I sought to gratify my tastes. We had several pieces of furniture in the house, which had been brought from Europe. These I examined again and again, wondering where the wood grew, whether the workmen who made them still survived, and what they could be doing with themselves now. Then we had several oil paintings and rare old engravings of my father's, which he himself had bought in Paris, hanging up in the dining room. 2 of these were sea pieces. One represented a fat-looking, smoky fishing boat, with 3 whiskerandos in red caps, and their trousers' legs rolled up, hauling in a seine. There was high, French-like land in one corner, and a tumble-down gray lighthouse surmounting it. The waves were toasted brown, and the whole picture looked mellow and old. I used to think a piece of it might taste good. The other represented 3 old-fashioned French men-of-war with high castles, like pagodas, on the bow and stern, such as you see in Froissart, and snug little turrets on top of the mast, full of little men, with something undefinable in their hands. All 3 were sailing through a bright blue sea, blue as Sicily's skies, and they were leaning over on their sides at a fearful angle, and they must have been going very fast, for the white spray was about the bows like a snowstorm. Then we had 2 large green French portfolios of colored prints, more than I could lift at that age. Every Saturday my brothers and sisters used to get them out of the corner where they were kept, and spreading them on the floor, gaze at them with never-failing delight. They were of all sorts. Some were pictures of Versailles, its masquerades, its drawing-rooms, its fountains, and courts, and gardens, with long lines of thick foliage cut into fantastic doors and windows, and towers and pinnacles. Others were rural scenes, full of fine skies, pensive cows standing up to the knees in water, and shepherd boys and cottages in the distance, half concealed in vineyards and vines. And others were pictures of natural history, representing rhinoceroses and elephants and spotted tigers, and above all there was a picture of a great whale, as big as a ship, stuck full of harpoons, and 3 boats sailing after it as fast as they could fly. Then, too, we had a large library case that stood in the hall, an old brown library case, tall as a small house. It had a sort of basement, with large doors and a lock and key, and higher up there were glass doors, through which might be seen long rows of old books that had been printed in Paris and London and Leipzig. There was a fine library edition of The Spectator in 6 large volumes with gilded backs, and many a time I gazed at the word London on the title page. And there was a copy of D'Alembert in French, and I wondered what a great man I would be if, by foreign travel, I should ever be able to read straight along without stopping out of that book, which now was a riddle to every one in the house but my father, whom I so much liked to hear talk French, as he sometimes did to a servant we had. That servant, too, I used to gaze at with wonder, for in answer to my incredulous cross-questions, he had over and over again assured me that he had really been born in Paris. But this I never entirely believed, for it seemed so hard to comprehend how a man who had been born in a foreign country could be dwelling with me in our house in America. As years passed on, this continual dwelling upon foreign associations bred in me a vague prophetic thought that I was fated, one day or other, to be a great voyager, and that just as my father used to entertain strange gentlemen over their wine after dinner, I would hereafter be telling my own adventures to an eager auditory. And I have no doubt that this presentiment had something to do with bringing about my subsequent rovings. But that which perhaps more than anything else converted my vague dreamings and longings into a definite purpose of seeking my fortune on the sea was an old-fashioned glass ship, about 18 inches long, and of French manufacture, which my father, some 30 years before, had brought home from Hamburg as a present to a great uncle of mine. Senator Wellingborough, who had died a member of Congress in the days of the old Constitution, and after whom I had the honor of being named. Upon the decease of the senator, the ship was returned to its donor. It was kept in a square glass case, which was regularly dusted by one of my sisters every morning, and stood on a little claw-footed Dutch tea-table in one corner of the sitting-room. This ship, after being the admiration of my father's visitors in the capital, became the wonder and delight of all the people of the village where we now resided, many of whom used to call upon my father for no other purpose than to see the ship. And well did it repay the long and curious examinations which they were accustomed to give it. In the first place, every bit of it was glass, and that was a great wonder of itself, because the masts, yards, and ropes were made to resemble exactly the corresponding parts of a real vessel that could go to sea. She carried 2 tiers of black guns all along her 2 decks, and often I used to try to peep in at the portholes to see what else was inside, but the holes were so small, and it looked so very dark indoors, that I could discover little or nothing, though when I was very little I made no doubt that if I could but once pry open the hull and break the glass all to pieces, I would infallibly light upon something wonderful, perhaps some gold guineas, of which I have always been in want, ever since I could remember. And often I used to feel a sort of insane desire to be the death of the glass ship, case and all, in order to come at the plunder. And one day, throwing out some hint of the kind to my sisters, they ran to my mother in a great clamor, and after that the ship was placed on the mantelpiece for a time, beyond my reach, and until I could recover my reason. I do not know how to account for this temporary madness of mine, unless it was that I had been reading in a storybook about Captain Kidd's ship that lay somewhere at the bottom of the Hudson, near the Highlands, full of gold as it could be, and that a company of men were trying to dive down and get the treasure out of the hold, which no one had ever thought of doing before, though there she had lain for almost 100 years. Not to speak of the tall masts and yards and rigging of this famous ship, among whose mazes of spun glass I used to rove in imagination till I grew dizzy at the main truck, I will only make mention of the people on board of her. They, too, were all of glass, as beautiful little glass sailors as anybody ever saw, with hats and shoes on, just like living men, and curious blue jackets with a sort of ruffle round the bottom. 4 or 5 of these sailors were very nimble little chaps, and were mounting up the rigging with very long strides, but for all that they never gained a single inch in the year, as I can take my oath. Another sailor was sitting astride of the spanker boom, with his arms over his head, but I never could find out what that was for. A second was in the foretop, with a coil of glass rigging over his shoulder. The cook, with a glass axe, was splitting wood near the forehatch. The steward, in a glass apron, was hurrying toward the cabin with a plate of glass pudding, and a glass dog with a red mouth was barking at him, while the captain in a glass cap was smoking a glass cigar on the quarter-deck. He was leaning against the bulwark, with one hand to his head. Perhaps he was unwell, for he looked very glassy out of the eyes. The name of this curious ship was Lorraine, or the Queen, which was painted on her stern where anyone might read it, among a crowd of glass dolphins and sea-horses carved there in a sort of semicircle. And this Queen rode undisputed mistress of a green glassy sea, some of whose waves were breaking over her bow in a wild way, I can tell you, and I used to be giving her up for lost and foundered every moment, till I grew older and perceived that she was not in the slightest danger in the world. A good deal of dust and fuzzy stuff like down had, in the course of many years, worked through the joints of the case, in which the ship was kept, so as to cover all the sea with a light dash of white, which, if anything, improved the general effect, for it looked like the foam and froth raised by the terrible gale the good Queen was battling against. So much for Lorraine. We have her yet in the house, but many of her glass spars and ropes are now sadly shattered and broken. But I will not have her mended, and her figurehead, a gallant warrior in a cocked hat, lies pitching head foremost down into the trough of a calamitous sea under the bows. But I will not have him put on his legs again till I get on my own, for between him and me there is a secret sympathy, and my sisters tell me that even yet that he fell from his perch the very day I left home to go to sea on this my first voyage. Well, there you go, Herman Melville channeling his contemporary Dickens, and also foreshadowing Proust.